Jake, I need to be a co-host too.
Yeah, I was just noticing that there's no Mechitza here.
There's no mechitza. Yes. That's a great point. I don't know. So, right. So it's probably a German synagogue. So a lot of like Western European synagogues were like the culture at large, where men and women would not be separated, where the sermon would be in the vernacular, in the language of the vernacular. Jake, I think you need to make me a co-host again too. Excellent. Yeah, it's modern. It's future focused. It's going forward. It's acknowledging that transition. Are there people on this call whose families weren't yet here in 1926? My family was all here, I think, by this time, but there were still a lot of Jews in Europe. 1926 was relatively late if you look at the timeline of the Holocaust that's there. So Nussbaum is this is what's amazing about his art, is he's literally portraying in this moment what is happening to Jewish people at the time. Any other questions or comments? Okay. All right, Jake, we're going to go to the next slide. Thanks so much. Sorry. Go ahead. Yes.
My comment was, I know it's probably just his talit, but it looks like the stripes from the clothes in the concentration camps.
Right, which they don't know yet will be. Right. But yes. Excellent. Okay, and then someone put in the chat, I just saw, I'm sorry, Jake, are you able to read the chat? I'm on like 3 screens at once, trying to keep...
Yes, we have Margaret, who said women might be seated upstairs, and Deborah said my family was in Poland at this time.
Perfect. All right, thank you. All right, so the next image, and the next image that you have on the screen is from 1941. So what happens to Nussbaum and his girlfriend is that they are they go to Belgium to have a life there, and Germany occupies Belgium in 1940, and he is arrested and he is sent to an internment camp at St. Cyprien. Now, I hadn't known, so this is like not a concentration camp, but an actual internment camp with other aliens. It was in southern France. It was very, very hot, and a lot of inmates actually died of disease. Now, and here, Nussbaum, who had been a pretty secular German Jew, understood that he was part of the Jewish people, very much so, that as much as in that first image, he portrayed himself as separate, right? That the cantor was more traditional, there were more traditional people in the room, but he was future focused and more secular. Once you put him, and a lot of Jews experience this, remember, Hitler went back, if you had one of your 4 grandparents were Jewish, you were Jewish under the laws of Hitler, where this realization that you're part of the Jews. So look at this painting here as compared to the first painting. You have the same thing happening, right? You have Jews gathered together, possibly in prayer, possibly in hiding. It's not quite clear. It's not quite sure what is happening at this moment. But if you want to say it's prayer, it's a very different scene from the first. What are some differences that you see just between the first and the second scene? Feel free to unmute or put in the chat. It's easier if you unmute or talk for me, if you want to make my life easier, but you can put in the chat. I'm a chat person. I like chat. So, but I mean, same thing, Jews praying. And what's going on here?
There's no beautiful synagogue around them.
Yeah, it's all gone. The synagogue is all gone. And also, while in the first picture, Felix is looking right at you, where are people faced here? They're away. Their face, no one can even look at the artist. No one can, you can't, it's just, you can't even look. Now, this is 41. There's going to be a lot more worse to happen, right? I always think about that with the Holocaust. Like, think of the worst day you've ever had, and imagine that for years upon a time. That's what you have here. And the colors, not just are you not in a beautiful synagogue, but the colors he chooses to use. Oh, so how do we have so many of Nussbaum's paintings? A lot of them were at his house. They were preserved and kept at his house. And some, it's not clear how all of them survived, but after the war, there were some that were found at his house. Either somehow they made it back or he got them there. But it's remarkable that we have this art of his. Because remember, you think of Trajan style where art was produced, but it was produced under duress with Nazi supplied materials to show, oh, the kids are just fine, they're drawing. But Felix Nussbaum is producing art as the events are happening, right, for himself or for whoever. All right. This is a very, very different image. But again, what's amazing about Nussbaum, for looking at Jewish events in the 20th century, literally the art is speaking of the event in the same way 1926 reflected a Jewish reality for a lot of people. This 1941 image, which includes a diminished Nussbaum, reflects what's going on. And then this crushing picture. And if we ever, Jacob, we can go to the next picture, which is self-portrait with Jewish identity card. This is the weirdest thing. If you're ever on the Bima, notice there's a book in the Mishpacha room, and this painting is on the cover. It haunts me every Shabbat. I look at that book and its cover and look out there. As I said, I saw this painting in person at the Barbican in London, in this amazing exhibit that took place in the early 90s. It is everything. In 1943, a little more than a year before his murder in Auschwitz, he painted this painting, Self-Portrait with Jewish Identity Card. I want, Deborah, I'm going to look at your comment here. Yes, so Jews have become impersonalized, only the brand of the Talit. I also want you to look, there's some details that, again, like this is not my observation. These are observations of brilliant people who looked at the painting. If you're able to enlarge your screen, I want you to look at a couple of things behind Nussbaum. I want you to see on the right that there is a tree that is cut off, that is totally cut off. And yet on the lower limb of the dead tree on the right side, there's a little bit of life coming. There's a little bit of life, a little bit of blue sky behind, representing that perhaps somewhere there is some remnant of hope, some remnant that there will be a future. And then to the left, if you notice the windows, which people understand, there's no one in those windows. No one has come to save and help. So there are windows to look at. There are people who can look at what's going on, but they are not doing anything. If you want a painting that reflects the Jewish reality of someone in Europe in 1944, this is everything. And then, of course, if you go back to Nussbaum, you see that familiar yellow star and the identity card. And again, I mean, first of all, he's like 18 years older than that original synagogue picture, but he has aged a lifetime. He is again looking at the camera, but I mean at the viewer, but not with the confidence and bravado of a young man like he was in that 1921 picture, but with a man who has been defeated and is in the shadow of death and in this horrible predicament. And yet is still able to, in the background, have that dying tree have a little bit of blossom that's there, which is just absolutely remarkable. So that is Nussbaum. That is a perspective. I'm going to just look at your chats now. And that is a perspective of literally in the events, portraying events in the art. We don't often, and it's funny, if you think about Jewish art, you think of like Chagall and, goats flying through the sky, or Kadishman, which we'll look at it a little bit, these kind of classic metaphorical images. This is reality. And that's what's remarkable about his painting. There's a couple of reasons we don't have a lot of this. One is a lot of Jews didn't survive it. Probably a lot of this was destroyed. By the way, I just saw a news flash right before that Barba Yar, which was a site of large killing, might have been damaged in Kiev now, that site there. So you talk about like what's not preserved, what's not important for your enemies to preserve. And the other thing is, even though there were Jewish artists, there's this understanding that the no graven images is let a lot of Jews not to go in professions of art. Also, we didn't have the luxury. Suzanne says there's an open window catching some of the light too. More hope. Absolutely. Yes. That little bit of light it's definitely lighter painting color wise than the painting before. But there's just, it's like the light is barely coming through, that it's there. Also, a lot of Jews didn't have the luxury of being artists, right? Like the way the Jewish people might have been in their cultures, and because of our just reality as wandering Jews, always having an immigrant experience. Like with painting, you really need a patron, you need a studio, you need a supply. So just a remarkable thing to see. I'm just gonna look at the chat if there's anything else. Or does anyone have any? Nussbaum haunts me. He like literally when even though this was inspired by the Dali, it was like, I have to start with this image. This image is just with me always. Any other comments or questions? Okay, thanks. Jake, if you can go on to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so the second perspective we're going to look at in modern art is actually the taking of ancient texts. So Jake, if you'll go to the next slide, thanks so much. The story that is probably portrayed in art and in a lot of Israeli poetry, as much as any other, is this moment in Genesis 22. We read it in the cycle of Torah reading, and then we read it again on Rosh Hashanah, which is the binding of Isaac. I just put a little bit of the beginning here, just to have a taste of it. Herb, do you mind unmuting and just reading what's on the screen? Are you able to read? This is just the beginning of the story. I just want to jog your memory.
Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, Here I am. And he said, Take your son, your favorite son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar.
And that's just the beginning. That's all we're going to look at. Jake, you can go to the next slide. But if you remember how the story goes, Abraham gets as far as having the knife above Isaac's head. And it's only when the angel is to call twice to stop Abraham from sacrificing his son Isaac that Abraham stops. There's a ram that's caught in the bushes. Instead, that is sacrificed, hence the shofar, right? The connection with shofar and Rosh Hashanah. And the next thing anyone know the next thing that happens in Torah after this moment? And we don't know if the 2 things are connected or not. We'll never know, but we can guess. Anybody know the next thing that happens in Torah? Anybody remember? It has to do with
Sarah.
With Sarah dies. Hi,
Right.
Sarah. The next thing we hear about is the death of Sarah. So it's never made clear to the reader of Torah if Isaac lived or died. This story, where you have a zealous, God-cleaving, believing character in Abraham, where you have an innocent sacrifice in Isaac, where you have a someone who's has things taken out of her control in Sarah, where you have a ram that sacrificed. All the imagery of this story provides potent fodder for a people who has known all of these things, who've known intense love of God, Torah, and of Israel, who've known the reality of sacrifice, of loss of life or near loss of life or suffering for being Jewish, that know the what Sarah knew, which is things beyond our control. And so all these things provide incredible fodder for not just, we're not looking at poetry here, but there's so much. This story resonates with Israelis very much, especially in wartime, where you send your child out and you don't know if they're going to come back. And that's the reality for many Israeli families. Obviously, like just the reality of war with what's going on in Ukraine right now, sits large with all of us here. And so this story becomes a powerful place where 20th century artists, Jewish and non-Jewish, go. It is different than what Nussbaum is doing, and yet it is still portraying events. It's with the lens of Torah, but looking at 20th century events. So this first piece is Sarah. It's from 1947. That's obviously a very potent year for the Jewish people because it's the year that the UN vote will happen, but there is not a state yet, and yet the Holocaust has happened. So Mordecai Ardone, if you can go, Jake, if you can go forward one slide and then go back. I just had to show you this because it's so cool. So Mordecai Ardone was born in 1896 in a small Polish village of Tuchow. After World War I, he left for Paris, as many artists did, and then went to Berlin, like Nussbaum, and enrolled there. He lived in the house. He rented a room from Paul Klee. I love Klee stuff, so I have that here. That's something my ex-husband has. I love this poster. So I was like, oh, there's a little Klee in our house. So it's actually in Hebrew. It says it too. It's an exhibit from Israel of Klee stuff. Jake can go back to the slide before. He actually, in 1933, when the Nazis came to power, he went to Israel. This is something that you never think about in making Aliyah. And then maybe those of you who moved from New York to Florida or the Midwest to Florida experienced the same thing. The light of Israel was too much for his eyes. He found the sky blinding. I don't know if you've been, there are those Florida days. I don't know if you have where like, it's just so bright. And Germany ain't looking like this. Poland ain't looking like this. But the brightness of Israel really got to Ardone, and he struggled with light in his paintings a lot of time. He wasn't sure what to do with all this light. It was just such a, and you think about when you travel around the world, what it looks like or in New York City versus, what it might look like in Paris or what it might look like in Poland or Ukraine right now or Israel, whatever. And he couldn't handle the light. It was too much for his eyes. And so he actually retreated to his home where he started to paint these kind of sunless, dark, brooding portraits. And then ultimately he adjusted. He was able to get used to the light, and he was able to come out and be part of the world at large. But the light really affected him deeply. And think about like, what an incredible minute. Like you're leaving the darkest place in the world for a Jew in 1933, Europe. And you're going to what then at the time is British Mandate Palestine, but you can't handle the brightness of it. It becomes very powerful to think about the state of the Jewish people, that no matter where we are, there's a too much of something, or there's something we're leaving behind that is painful. So Ardone takes, so there's a lot of midrash. Torah doesn't say this, but there's a lot of midrash that come to understand that Sarah gets wind of what Abraham has done with Isaac and Mount Moriah, even though he's not sacrificed him, but just the idea of the father hanging a knife over his son, and it kills her. Here, and because the next thing we hear about in Torah is the death of Sarah, here you have the opposite of this. And I looked for as good a piece as I could, an image as possible. It's a hard image to see, but it's very powerful because you have not here a dead Sarah, but you have a dead Isaac. And it just becomes a metaphor for, so fine, Ardone is in Israel, but he still knows of what has happened to all those Jews that are in Europe, to the Holocaust. And it is with the shock of this that he depicts this moment here. It is this story, this Genesis story, is an obsession for many artists and thinkers. I'm going to share with you a couple of other portrayals of it. Before we do that, I'm just going to see if there's any questions or comments before we go on. Okay, Jake, we can go to the next slide. The next one, sorry, after that. I'm just schwitzing with my clay. I have some stuff in person. Okay. So some stuff I actually have physically here. I had never heard of Magda. Sorry, while I lean over for a second. So I would say probably 9 months ago or so, someone contacted the synagogue and they said, we want to donate Magda Watts to the temple. And Magda Watts, as you can see on the screen, was deported from Hungary to Auschwitz at the age of 15. She survived for 7 months. And she escaped Auschwitz through a selection of people by the Siemens Company who came to choose girls for slave labor in Nuremberg. Lonely and depressed, she turned to making dolls from scraps of paper and rag. Now, this piece was not made during the Holocaust. This piece was made after, but this doll making skill that she developed. This is when it's a shame we're not in person, because I would love to pass this around. She ultimately made Aliyah and moved to Israel and made these ornate sculptures, of which she is famous for. So this is a very kind of traditional scene of people sitting around with the Rebbe and studying Torah and Tanakh and all those things. But her original thing, this is the way she survived, by making these sculptures. Again, you have a 20th century artist that is not an artist by choice like Nussbaum or Ardone, but an artist by survival. And what you see here, and Jake, we can go to the next slide, is just the complexity of what it means to depict Jewish events in 20th century art. Okay, this Kadishman I picked, we're going to look at his Binding of Isaac sculpture in a second. I think one of the things that happens with art sometimes is we get like a certain image. So if you go into any gift shop in Israel or art gallery in Israel, you'll see a Kadishman, these recognizable sheep's heads that were part of what he did. But this is if you can go, Jake, to the next slide. This is from Menashe Kadishman. If you can see, can someone read? I see the font is a little funky. Barbara, can I ask you to unmute and read, Barbara Barlow? I'm trying to unmute you, and if you can read,
yeah,
go ahead.
Turn a light on.
So this is a sculpture that's in Tel Aviv of Kadishman. So if you can go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, the sacrifice of Isaac, Kadishman, the sacrifice of wait a minute. Actually, it's too dark for me to read.
Okay.
Can somebody read it? Here.
Is someone else able to read it?
I can read it, Rabbi.
Go ahead.
Menashe Kadishman, born 1932, Tel Aviv, is an Israeli sculptor and painter. In his youth, Kadishman worked as a shepherd, and his experiences with nature, sheep, and shepherding had a significant impact on his artistic career. Much of his work, including his Sacrifice of Isaac sculpture, address the violence of, I can't read.
Civilization.
And the destruction, I can't read the rest. It's too dark.
That's fine. The destruction of orientation of civilization. So if you think about it, you have the Holocaust, and then you have the birth of the modern day state of Israel, and then the reality of war that happens in that state from the very beginning. And so the Binding of Isaac story becomes a powerful metaphor for those wars and of sending your children out. And here you see this Kadishman sculpture where you have the ram on top, who ultimately will be sacrificed, and you have flipped over this Isaac that's below. And it's almost as if the ram is in the place of Abraham. That's the position that Abraham would have been on to be over Isaac, was bound, remember, lying down. Instead, you've put the ram there. And no matter what, no matter who you put at the top, and it's like the painting before, Isaac gets sacrificed, and it becomes a powerful metaphor for the people. Jake, if you can go to the next slide that's there. This one, this is McBee. Again, talking about who is a Jewish artist. So Richard McBee is an American artist who actually didn't even know he was Jewish until he was 20 years old. His father was Irish and Native American, and his mother was a secular German Jew. He only became aware at 20 that he was Jewish, and really only at 40 did he start portraying this these biblical moments. And of course, the binding of Isaac became one of those moments. And what he does here is makes Abraham loom very, very large. And if you see on the right side of Abraham, it's almost, Isaac becomes like one with Abraham's body, almost is a passive, pitiful Isaac. And McBee just struggled with how Isaac could be so passive, but all the more so how God could ask for such a sacrifice. And he views Abraham as like this monstrous character. And if you look at the way that the Jewish experience has been in the 20th century, there were so many Abrahams, not Abraham, the good Abraham, that we see of Torah, but Abrahamic situations where we were Isaac, where we did not have control of what was going on. And McBee has a lot of anger, upsetness with Abraham in this picture. He's dropping the knife, but he's not dropping the knife, as McBee has explained, because he cares about Isaac, but because an angel has told him to. And he wants to depict Isaac as the rational character here, the one who is of peace, of passivity, of who like just has lost control of what's going on, and Abraham as this non-thinking pietistic character, and doesn't want us to be like that Abraham. But it's a very beautiful, I found it a very powerful and beautiful image. So again, you have an artist who doesn't find out he's Jewish until his 20s, but finds a resonance with this. Jake, if you could want to go to the next slide. Okay, so Jake, if you can share that link. So the next piece of 20th century art I want to show you is a very complicated piece. I learned about these artists during Schnock, and you'll see up on the screen in a second, from Irvin Littman, Dr. Irvin Littman, who's the head of the Boca Raton Museum of Art, and their work has actually been here in Boca Raton. They are two German artists who, Jake, do you want me to share, or you got it?
I got it.
Okay, go, if you can go down to the bus, or the buses. There's a couple of buses that you'll see in a second. So they are not Jewish, and yet they have made the decision to portray the Holocaust in several different ways. So earlier, we were supposed to go to Nuremberg and Berlin, and we were going to visit with them. So it hurts my heart a little to see all this now, but hopefully we'll get there eventually. So they've done many things to mark the Holocaust with their art around Berlin. And one of the things that they did is, I don't even know if exhibit is the right word, or an experience or cultural event that they did, is they took, those regular buses that you would see in a European city. And can you see what's on with the, a bus at the top lists destination. So where are these buses going to?
Concentration.
Exactly. And if you think of, talk about the 20th century from the beginning to the end, that you have, the creation of the car and motor vehicles and buses and cities and transportation and all the good things that could come out of that in the way society grew. And you marry that with places of destruction and death and pain. And it's a very provocative image. I think of it as art. They were actually driving around the city. Here they're portrayed as photos, but they're actually around the city. And this is how two non-Jews chose to take they were trying to shock people, and take a symbol of a city like a bus, which is just a nothing. You see buses all the time, and shock people and open their eyes. And it becomes an incredible metaphor for the Holocaust, because like people just went about. There were so many bystanders that let things happen and had their lives go on as normal. And I guess it resonates with what's going on with us now, while there's such pain and difficulty in the world. I hope we get to Berlin to see them one day, but these are remarkable. Jake, if you'll go back to the slideshow, I want to share, the last thing I want to share is a personal an artist who I came to know personally. He died in 2019. So as you know, some of you know, there's a big thing I do called Project Nuremberg, which is I rescued a set of books from the Nuremberg trials that Lynn University almost threw away, and it's really become a big part of my life. And so if anyone hears about something Nuremberg, then they'll send it my way. So probably 6 or 7 years ago, Lisa Messenger, whose husband was Aaron Pankin, who was the dean of our rabbinical school, Hebrew Union College, said to me, our Hebrew Union College in New York has an exhibit of an artist who was a guard during Nuremberg. So his name was Nathan Helu. He lived into his early 90s. You can see me with him in his one-room apartment in the Lower East Side of New York City, on Bialystok Street. And Nathan was a guard at the Nuremberg trial. So he was a 19-year-old after World War II ended, and he was sent to Nuremberg to guard the Nazis who were being tried at Nuremberg. I think it actually drove him crazy. He never married. He never had kids. He came back and he worked in the Strand bookstore his whole life. And he is what is known as an outsider artist. So there's one of his pieces in the article there, and then I have it's like so poorly kept. I have one of those I have so much of his art because I developed a friendship with him and a correspondence with him, and he would send stuff to me. He would send stuff to our eighth graders. Our eighth graders would correspond with him. He was an amazing human being, and I would visit him in New York. And he portrayed many things in his art, but one of the things that he portrayed a lot was what he saw at the Nuremberg trials. And here you have, this is Hess and Goering and Keitel, some of the defendants who were at the Nuremberg trials as he drew them. He says one of the myths of Nuremberg is how Goering died. He died by cyanide the night before he was supposed to be hung. Some say that his wife snuck him a cyanide capsule in their last kiss before he was going to be hung in the morning. Others say an American guard developed sympathy for him and snuck him the cyanide. Nathan Helu says he witnessed that. I don't know if he did or not. And with age, a lot of his pieces, I have a whole pile here, he writes his private first class, his number and his name. He writes his number he was signed in the military. And he just drew and drew and drew and drew. And there's a connection to Boca with Nathan Helu. What happened is there's a bakery that was near Nathan's house that he had drawn an image of women baking challah for Shabbat. And the bakery put it in the window. And Walter O'Neill, who headed the Boca Raton School of Art for many years, discovered Nathan. And he's what's known as an outsider artist, not trained in any way, but just produced volumes and volumes of images. And he's been shown. And there's a documentary that's supposed to be made about him. It's taking a long time. I know that I've been in touch with the filmmaker. Tablet did a story on him in 2012, as you can see here. And in some ways, Nathan is the epitome of what we're talking about here, because you have these events that happen, and then an artist portrays them, but they're not just portrayed in the moment of that painting. If you're a human being, they touch you deep, deep down inside, and they change you. And in my mind, looking at Nathan, he was transformed. He had a front row seat to what was going on in the Nuremberg trials, and it touched him so deeply in one way that I think he just was never able to shake himself from that and what he had seen. But in another way, he just had this, something in him was tapped, and he just had to draw and get it all out. And that's the complexity of looking at these major events in the 20th century and seeing how they're portrayed. Like, you have a moment that you're witnessing in in whatever you're viewing, but think about what the artist has gone through. Think about what Felix Nussbaum went through and then portrayed that. Think about what Nathan Helu went through and then portrayed that. Think about what, for Stern Schank, who did the buses, like what it means to grow up in Germany with the Holocaust kind of hanging over here. It's interesting. One of the facts, and Jake can go to the next slide, one of the pieces of information that's been reported about what's going on in Ukraine is that this is the first time, I don't want to get it wrong, so I don't want to say it wrong, but it's the first time Germany has done something with weapons since World War II. And I heard a story, there's like 300 tanks left in Germany today. So you think about how the world changed, but what it felt like to live through that time. So I'm just going to check on the chat and see if there's anything there. No, so the Dolly, so let me tell you what's happening the next couple of weeks. So I see Susan Podolsky's on. I don't know if Dr. Carol Salas is on as well, but for the next 3 weeks, we're going to have an art historian whose name is Dr. Carol Salas. She's out of Ohio. She's amazing. She has a really personal, interesting connection to Roy Lichtenstein. We'll learn about over the 3 weeks. Next week with her, we're going to look at the Holocaust memorials and how you choose to mark this event through art. The week after that, so 2 weeks from today, Susan Podolsky and I are going to be sitting in front of that Dolly, broadcasting from there. And Susan and Carol will talk about that Dolly. I will tell you, and again, I don't know if Carol's on or not, but Dolly was not a perfect figure, as many artists are not, as many of us are not. It was very flawed. And there's a lot of complexity in looking into Dolly and what he portrayed and why and how. And so it'll be really interesting to learn with Carol that part of Dolly, and then from Susan, how Susan, who really has guided so much of the art that is now hanging on our walls, and specifically how she handled placing this Dolly. And then the third week, Carol has a special connection with Roy, the painter Roy Lichtenstein, which you'll learn about. Very special. There's a short documentary we'll watch, and then our fourth week will come in all together. Herb, I see your hand up. Did you have a question or no? You're muted, so I'm gonna. No? Okay, I can't hear. Any other questions or comments? Okay, thanks. Any other questions or comments that are there? Fabulous. All right. Well, it's wonderful to see everyone. Have a great week. We're really excited to have Dr. Carol Salas with us for the next 3 weeks for this. And I end, purposely with this Felix Nussbaum image, and I hope it stays with you as much as it stays with me. Thanks to Jake Harris, our awesome producer, and have a wonderful week. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Just great.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.